All right. So, all right. Obviously this is I enjoy Brene Brown a lot. She's a psychologist by training. Greg might correct me. But she's written several books, done a lot of talks. She's got a piece on Netflix. If you ever have time to watch it, it's quite good. She's kind of like the popular mental health lady. So she's got all the cute stuff. But if you want to take a dabble, she's out there. So the dark does not destroy the light, it defines it. It's our fear of dark that casts our joy into the shadows. So now, as we go on, obviously, this is basic. It's an unknown quote. I say it all the time. I don't know if it comes from anywhere in particular, but none of us are going to make it out of this thing alive. So, obviously, compassionate death, the reason why we're talking about it today is that it is a part of life. There is no miracle cure, spring of youth. You can have your brain cryogenically frozen like Elvis or whoever, but we're not going to make it out of this alive, and we don't have the science right now to prolong life in that sense. Even though the average age up into the last few years has continued to increase, average lifespan, we don't have like the miracle drugs. So it's going to be Morbid Sunday. So many of you might be wondering why I had taken interest in this topic or where it comes from, and it largely relates to my personal journey in life. Um, Obviously, as a child growing up, one of the things that was interesting is that on my mother's side of the family, her grandmother came from a very large family. And that when I was a younger child, between like the age of 5 or 6 and then into my early teens, my grandma's siblings started dying off. And so, as a result, as a child, I got to kind of vicariously witness the process of death and the things that go along with it, from conversations, old family wounds, the planning of funerals, the routines, the rituals, organizational logistical nightmares, things like that. Um, and then for a while after I moved out of Minnesota, that kind of changed. And from there, I, took a period of time and went through my own like grieving process in a sense of changes in life, family connections, things like that, going out on my own, and some emotional maturing and weathering. And then when I started working with Sioux Community Health Center, I started there, it would have been about 8 years ago now, 8.5, I don't know. But with that, I started working in the HIV program as a caseworker. And so a lot of my job dealt with prevention, but a big portion of the job also involved working with people living with HIV. And so one of the things around that is that with the HIV epidemic, in the early days of that epidemic, we didn't have the miracle drugs that were discovered in the 90s. And so for those that had survived or held on long enough to finally get access to those medications, many of them had been through periods of their life where they watched, they were surrounded by death, basically. If they, many close-knit communities experienced death on a larger scale because medically we didn't have any interventions that could help them um, prevent that. And it was dying from HIV AIDS is not typically not a nice process. And with some of the societal strains and the biases and hate, those types of things, it could be rather difficult and isolating depending on the situation. And so working with those individuals, once again, vicariously, I got to, one of the things that kind of made me busy in my work is I like to take the time and listen and hear their stories. They're not my stories to tell, but their experiences with death and losing people and the things that they went through. And then in later years, I've had some people that are closer to me die, and just kind of how that happens. And so, as a part of that, A while back, a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you should have your tarot cards read." And it's always one of those fun things like, "Oh, let's see, how good are they? What are they going to say?" And one of at the time, the lady that did my cards, she laid out my cards and she just kind of looked at me and got this funny look in her eye. And she said, "My goodness, you are just surrounded by death." And so it's one of those things that made sense based on some of the things that I'd been through with my work. And then a coworker of mine who was a social worker made the suggestion, possibly at one point in time, to explore becoming kind of like a grief counselor or a death doula, which I'll talk about later. But that's just kind of where my interest in this topic comes from and why it's something that I think is important to talk about. All right, so sharks don't just live in the water. And by that, I mean that throughout life as we go, when we look at predatory practices, whether it's in financial lending, all those things, there's kind of those beings or individuals or groups or organizations or companies that kind of like prey on the less fortunate, the weak, the unknowing, however you want to put it. So it's one of those things. It's kind of important to remember that we have to, in our zest for life, be vigilant and educate ourselves and be knowledgeable and learn and ask questions and get second opinions and things like that as we go. Otherwise, sometimes those sharks through, it's kind of like when we look at the novel, I can hear the music with the tuba. Can't think of it right now. That created the Sharkmania. I can't think. Oh, it's the classic Spielberg. So when we think about that, there's a lot of fear mongering that can happen with death. And so we have to be conscious of that when we're going through these things, to be critical in how we view things and also take an inventory of the emotional impacts and things like that. Because in the end, it is a journey, and depending on how we go through it, there's a lot of things that we can learn about ourselves, about the people around us, and also about our communities, our history, our ancestors, culture, things like that. So that being said, Brene Brown again, no one belongs here more than you. And so, like I said, none of us are going to make it out of this alive. And in the past, depending on all of our different experiences, we've been through like meetings, conferences, continuing education, or things like that have breakout sessions where you can kind of get to pick and choose, like, oh, I want to learn more about this. I want to learn more about that. I want to, or at some point we attended some type of education where we had elective classes that we could take to get our degree or certificate, but that weren't required, but were beneficial. So the reality is that death is a part of life. No one gets out of it. We are all going to die at some point. So it is my opinion that learning, talking, and being familiar with the death and dying process of life should be a required part of education. I think it's one of those things of, if we are afraid of it, we don't talk about it, we don't deal with it, that's when it becomes an issue. But if we are realistic in approaching this as a part of life and one of those processes, it makes the whole thing a little less intimidating, and it also helps us help cope in a healthier manner. And there are certain portions of society that may try to treat, the part of death as an elective and avoid it. Like I said, it should be a required training so that we can properly go through the process. So life and death are a journey. So humans as a society, if we look at anthropology, culture, and origins of creation, or if you look at the Bible, take out the Bible's context, or even evolution, we tend to be a communal living animal. And in that process of living in community, there are traditions that are created and then handed down from generation to generation. Obviously, as a white person of Norwegian, German, Swedish, and Irish and Welsh descent, it's one of those things. That's kind of where my background comes from. But if we look over at Native American culture, if we look at people that are connected with their ancestors more, we see that some of those traditions are still very deeply rooted and continue to be handed down. There's, if we look at Japanese tradition, Chinese, African cultures, there's different things that have been handed down from generation to generation. And when we lose those traditions or the education and knowledge surrounding what a tradition is, or an interruption occurs, whether it's Native American boarding schools, slavery, mass incarceration, colonialization, um, what that does is it can impact the collective and societal psyche of the community. And with death being such a big part of life, if we are not familiar with what our lineage and background is regarding that, it can be very disruptive to how we handle those major life events. And then when we start looking across cultures, it's very interesting to see the similarities and differences that different cultures and traditions have in the process of death and dying. Um, as many of us are aware, in modern American culture, with the advent of Western medicine, some of those things we may have moved away from, strayed away from, or forgotten, because with kind of the grind of capitalism, we've continued to push, life-saving techniques and interventions medically to prolong life. And some of those things have been as a result of losing that history of the process of death and dying, and forgetting some of that and the fear of having to confront things in the unknown. So it's important to remember that. One of the things that we look at here, this is here. So this next quote here that I really liked when I was going through and doing my research, as you can see on the screen. So all of us change. Everyone in the world from birth to death becomes someone new again and again, and we are remade. So this is where I would like to go ahead and talk. So my social worker friend Monica, who was like, "Oh, you should really be a death doula," is someone who so she is the one that the church started helping create and host for a while, the Grandparents Raising Grandchildren group. It's a support group for grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. And Monica, this once again, it's her story to share, so I'm just going to share some of the basics. But her son committed suicide, and as a result, she ended up raising her grandson. And so, as a part of that, a big part of it is that grief process from losing a child, but also the emotional impacts of one generation changing their role in raising a generation that they weren't quite expected to do, and the grief that surrounds that. And then, as grandparents, part of the support group was coming around and dealing with those impacts and struggles that come with dealing with that process. So there's a great piece in the New York Times. I'm going to click the link here. I don't know if I can put this in the chat. I'm just going to put it in the chat so you guys could just click on it. Maybe I don't have access to that. Yeah, I don't have access to the chat, but once I stop sharing my screen, I'll go back and pull this so you can have it. So this is from an article from Abby Allen. It was published on June 24th of 2021. So the word doula comes from the Greek word meaning women who serve through, or a woman who serves. Though most people in modern day will associate it with someone who helps during the birth process or to usher in life. In recent years, more people are becoming to recognize the need for just as much assistance at the end of life. And that's kind of how the whole movement of the death positivity started to come about in the United States and gaining attention. And the movement of death positivity was popularized by mortician and writer Caitlin Doughty, and it encouraged folks to have an open mind and an open discussion on death and dying and people's feelings on mortality. And so part of death doulas, there's different trainings that you can go through in different aspects of the process of learning and things like that. And so part of what happens is that that individual kind of helps with ushering through the process of death and dying. And it's a popular term that we see in modern culture, but it's one of those things that's been around for a long time. If we think back to our different families, family structure, things like that in communities. For example, with my background, so my grandma Azam was, I guess, almost you would have called her like the responsible adult or the death doula in a sense of oftentimes on the phone tree, she was the one that when a sibling was dying, she would go through the process of notifying the needed people to be like, hey, this is going on. This is where their health's at. This is what, and so as a kid, I'd sit and watch her, in the kitchen, long phone with the cord, making phone calls. And then with members of the family that were not maybe financially able to, afford the process or needed help with the logistics and planning, someone who would go through and help with coordinating funeral arrangements, where is the funeral going to be held at, who's serving the food, what are some classic readings, things like that. So like Wind Beneath My Wings, or there's a Catholic song, uh, you know, uh, Wind Beneath My Wings is Bette Midler, but it's there's a Catholic, yeah, I'll just leave it there. But it's one of those songs. So there's some, certain staples and classics of the funeral process that, because of her background and experience, she was more familiar with and was able to help others with. And so, that's my personal experience. But then in other communities, you'll still see people that come in and help with the process. We have hospice workers, we have palliative care providers, nurses, doctors, hospice nurses, things like that. And if you're fortunate enough, you can have those individuals as a part of the process so that they can be supportive in that process, and to kind of help walk you through the way. Some of that role now in an industrial standard has been taken on by funeral directors, people like that that will guide you through like, this is what is normally done. But it's more of a standardized format and not so much specific around what that person's background is. So it's an interesting thing to take and be aware of. So obviously, let's see here. This is a scene from the First Wives Club. We all have that vision in our head of what a funeral should look like and what that's going to kind of entail and everything like that. So this is just, it was from a great movie. If you've never seen it, it's great. The funeral scene's wonderful, by the way. It's got a lot of humor, get a few good laughs out of it. And so we've got, just a scene of that sometimes there's the stereotypes and then there's reality. And so then there's another side of compassionate death that some people reference. And this is a movement that started out in Oregon, that's kind of controversial depending on what your beliefs and background is. But it's called Death with Dignity. And this has to do with the understanding that at a certain point, we will have people that have a terminal illness that, there is no medical intervention or cure for. And at some point, the dying process becomes quite painful. And so certain states have started passing legislation to allow individuals who are of sound mind to work with their healthcare provider to have the option so that they can go ahead and have the access to basically death with dignity. So to work with their provider. So like, for example, with Oregon's law, and I can send a link out on this too, because there's a website that talks about it. Not every state's different. But one of the things is where they can choose, as it gets to the point where obviously there's no cure, it's a chronic terminal illness. They can kind of coordinate that dying process, and it's typically done with barbiturates to go through and do that. But it's a journey, and everyone's differently, everything's different depending on your beliefs and background. It's almost kind of like the pro-life movement of it's a spectrum, and there's a variety of ways that people stand on that spectrum. So, with the start of life, we have people that it starts at inception of egg meets sperm, and that's a life, and you cannot do an abortion, things like that. The same goes with death. There are people that are like, it is a natural process that you're supposed to go through. Any aid in expediting that process, things like that, is a sin. It just depends on the beliefs. So it's an interesting conversation to have and some interesting headspace to get into as we go through that. One of the things, obviously, with the image of the San Francisco Bridge that I wanted to bring up is that it's a journey, and crossing over that bridge from one phase of life to the other, or the afterlife, or whatever you may call it. For some people, for atheists or some individuals, and you don't have to be an atheist and not believe in the afterlife, things like that. We just don't know what's out there, um, for some. And so it's important to remember that as we prepare for what I would call that journey in life, that we do some basic things. In my work as a caseworker, one of the things that we like to talk with people about is the fact that, we all have this ideal, version of, obviously right now you can't see me. I've got wood paneling behind me, but I'm actually giving this sermon from bed today, which is quite fabulous. Highly recommend it, but also frowned upon by many, I'm sure, especially based on today's topic. But one of the things is that we have this idea of like, I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to die in my sleep and peacefully die and just not wake up. And it's just going to be this nice, peaceful process. But the reality with life is that the majority of deaths, there's only a small portion of those statistically, and I don't have the number, that happen that way. And so as we prepare for that journey, there are some basic things that we need to make sure that we're doing to have a compassionate death, not just for ourselves, but for the people around us. And so one of those things that we talk about have to do with our final wishes, important things that we like to avoid talking about, but we want to have it done right. So my friend Linda Santee, her mother passed away last spring. And I've always said this even before Mickey died, but I'd always said there's nothing quite like a good Catholic funeral. The tradition, the ceremony, some of those things. And then from my background and upbringing, the prayer service the evening before, where traditionally there would be a sharing of memories by family members, friends that knew the loved one, things like that. And that was, for me, part of that Catholic funeral, that sharing process and the sharing of stories. There's nothing like a good Catholic funeral. And so Linda Santee, for her mother, she knocked it out of the park. And so Karen can talk to this, but there were several of us that way. And there were several recovering Catholics that went to Mickey's funeral that we agreed outside. But you know, we have to die before Linda Santee dies so that Linda Santee can plan our funeral, because the woman knows how to do it. But the reality is that life doesn't happen like that. So one of the things is that you have to have a plan in place to save on that grief for your loved ones. So, with my work as a caseworker and now as a resource coordinator, one of the things that we talked about is planning. So do you have a will in place? Do you have some direction so that when those things happen, so there's, the people around you that are trying to go through that process, they have a backbone of what to go through and a plan that's outlined. Do you have medical directives? Do you want me to yank the plug on you, or do you want me to leave you plugged in for a few weeks? What do you want to do? Don't leave those decisions on me to make. you know have that in writing so that the people that have to make, are having to go through that process, they feel supported and they feel like you're a part of that, and you're able, to have a say in how things are done. And there, of course, will always be things that come up that are unplanned. So a medical power of attorney is not a bad idea, and have conversations with that individual so that if it's something that comes up that wasn't outlined in your paperwork, they can feel comfortable making a decision that they feel like you would respect. The other thing is with paperwork, one of probably the more, I've talked about having PTSD, but one of the more traumatic experiences of my work as a caseworker was with um, a gay couple, two males, and the husband was dying. And at the time, because they lived in the state of Nebraska and the laws were different, um, the family of the person that was dying came in and basically took over the process, locked the husband out of the nursing home. And because he couldn't find their power of attorney paperwork, medical will, things like that, he was basically shut out of the death of his husband. And it was extremely traumatic. And as a support professional, there's vicarious trauma that comes from that, but trying to help with that grieving process and the trauma of that was just devastating. And so have those things lined up, make sure the people that need to know have access to that paperwork, know where it's at. So when the time comes, it's not any more traumatic than it needs to be for the people around you. Also comes for directives and funeral plans. I know we have several people that have had funerals that did not go nearly where they should have been. So it's just good to, have that stuff laid out when we talk about compassionate death. The other thing that I would like to talk about is social justice in the Unitarian Church and how that relates to death, which is quite interesting. So some people are aware of this, some people don't know, but when Medicare was established in 1965 with the Social Security Administration, one of the things that was covered under Medicare was hospice care and the end of life transition. Um, in an ideal world, the end of life transition should be a peaceful ceremony or process and not a chaotic period of trauma. With Western medicine and the interventions that we can do to try to prolong or save life, if we're in a busy hospital environment, that can sometimes occur if we are not quite sure what the goals are. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind. One of my instructors talked about how, in Japanese culture, they were over there at the time and a friend was dying. And while the death occurred in the hospital, it was a very quiet, respectful process. And so with hospice, a big thing that we can do as a social justice aspect is educate people what their rights are when it comes to hospice care, how it's paid for, and what services they have covered. And then following that, one of the big things that we need to look at for funding with, as a social justice platform for equitable funding of mental health care is how, we might fund one-on-one sessions, but how grief counseling isn't necessarily funded and how we provide reimbursement for grief support groups, things like that, so that we can have wider access to those things for individuals going through the grieving process. Because what we have to look at is how, an ideal world is that I'll live to be old and die old of old age, but there are premature deaths that happen, people that die young for a variety of reasons, and we have to look at as a society the gross cost of unresolved trauma and grief and the impact that that has on our communities and then also on individuals and their ability to lead healthy, happy, and successful lives if not handled in a healthy manner. And then there was a great piece, I couldn't find the link today, but I can send that out as well, that talked about an African American hospice group in Nashville, Tennessee, that was providing hospice care to African Americans, but also raising awareness so that those individuals be aware that, they can have, you don't have to die in a hospital or a place like that. You can have hospice care within your home. And that can be a right of yours depending on what's going on and everything like that. But then also as a community, creating spaces for individuals. Not everyone has a home that is equipped to get a hospital bed into, if that's the case, if they're going through hospice care, or a space where they feel comfortable having that space. So it's holding those spaces and creating those so that individuals can have access to that process. One of the things, there was a group in Sioux City that was trying to start like a hospice house, and there are issues with funding and getting that coordinated. But supporting and being aware of our nonprofit hospice of Siouxland, and also being familiar, there's other programs that do for-profit hospice work like the Croy Hospice, and just being aware of the difference there. So then my last slide here is, so basically, my closing thoughts were, so go out and make memories and make mistakes, and be honest and learn from each other and support each other in this miracle of science, otherwise known as life. Because despite all of our flaws, we have to sit back and appreciate the process and partake in the ritual of life, so that we can heal, grow, and celebrate that life. So I'm going to close the sermon portion with another quote from Brene Brown. Obviously, I like the woman. So, funerals, in fact, are one of the most powerful examples in the power of collective pain. They feature in a surprising finding from my research on trust. When I asked participants to identify 3 to 5 specific behaviors that their friends, family, and colleagues do that raise their level of trust with them, funerals always emerged in the top 3 responses. Funerals matter. Showing up to them matters. And funerals matter not just to the people grieving, but to everyone who is there. The collective pain and sometimes joy we experience when gathering in any way to celebrate the end of a life is perhaps one of the most powerful experiences of inextricable connection. Death, loss, and grief are the great equalizers. And that's from her book, Braving the Wilderness, The Quest for True Belonging and the Courage to Stand Alone. All right, so that concludes kind of my talk today. Sorry, I went a little long.